forced him to move so quickly, and he managed to get to Russia because of that. But at the time he was in Hong Kong, he then hooked up story, but he hooked up with some lawyers in Hong Kong that actually hid him among asylees in Hong Kong for a period of time while they lodged an asylum request with the United Nations body, and then sought to find a way to get him out of Hong Kong, actually China. And they actually bought tickets to about 6 or 7 different destinations. And he wound up on the one to Moscow. By the time he gets to Moscow, his passport's gone. He's sort of lost in translation, stuck.
Right.
And so part of the reason he's in Moscow and not, I think, where he'd like to be, which might be like Uruguay or Ecuador. I mean, the Assange fellow is in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Exactly.
He'd love to be in Ecuador too.
Right. Do you consider Snowden a hero?
Well, I think that former Attorney General Holder said we have him to thank for all these revelations. So hero I tend to reserve for people with sort of a more physical sense of bravery. But I think it took a lot of bravery and courage to do what he did. I mean, he wrecked his life, and he did it on kind of a wing and a prayer that people would care. I remember reading that one of the things that frightened him most was that he would do this and it wouldn't make an immediate splash, or it would be a splash and then it would disappear, and people wouldn't care. That the debate he claims he wanted to start wouldn't happen. Well, I mean,
he didn't fail in that regard.
He didn't fail in that regard. But
does it undercut him though to be in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it exposes him to all sorts of criticisms and accusations and sneers. Some of Trump's foreign policy people in particular have just been vicious about,
if he'd stayed in the U.S. and just said, I'm going to face the music, in some ways I think that would have been a preferable approach. I mean, it just said.
Except they charged him with a capital offense. The music would have been death. Now, granted, because of our broken death row system, he would be on death row for years and years and years. But to say that is the sort of burden that someone has to put on their shoulders. It was the espionage act. It was just like, remember Bridge of Spies, Rudolph Abel? It was espionage.
I think the likelihood, not that it would be much comfort to him, but the likelihood of it actually being imposed would be 1 in 10,000.
And even if he got it commuted to life, it would probably be in a supermax facility, which is so psychologically destructive. You know, you're in isolation 23 hours a day. So I don't think, I think the optics of being in Russia are bad optics for what he wants to achieve, but I don't know that I would impose on him the burden of facing the music.
So I've got another question. You seem to be saying that the 9/11 Commission was wrong about silos. I mean, the one major takeaway I took away from Slade Gordon's a friend, obviously Washington, is that siloing is a major problem. That the failure to communicate. But it sounded like you were saying that siloing has all sorts of bad effects in that it gets used by other agencies and other purposes that are more distant from the original purpose, and the other agencies aren't as sophisticated, particularly state and local, aren't as sophisticated as the national ones, and that all that connectivity is a menace.
Oh no, I agree with the 9/11 Commission that siloing had to go, but I think where they stopped short was in not recognizing that the opposite of siloing could also have some problems. You do want to consolidate and force sharing among these selfish, you might say, greedy intelligence agencies, turf-oriented intelligence. So you create the National Counterterrorism Center, you create the Terrorist Screening Center, by all means. But the problem was in allowing that then to be used against individuals in ways that our structure of civil liberties ought to prevent. I mean, it's not, in my view, necessarily the collection or gathering of information. We've been making lists forever and a day. That's how the cop on the street figures out what his beat should look like. The list of bad guys in his head. Now that list is very big now, and it's sort of dehumanized because it's atomized and it's capable of remembering a lot more. But it's what you do with the list. And so I think where the 9/11 Commission had a sort of lack of prescience was in realizing, if you do consolidate all this, you've got to put some structural limits on what they use the
Yeah, yeah.
information for.
No, and the list gathering versus the action, that is, I think, sound distinction. That makes sense. Okay, that's helpful, because I saw, I was,
Well, yeah, I'd be the last one to say, let's go back to siloing,
Right,
because you
right.
could still have the same pernicious effects. The FBI has a watch list and they use it.
Right.
And local law enforcement
Got
has
it.
a watch list and use it. The danger is in the use.
yeah, got it. Great job.
Oh,
Jim.
thanks very much.
Appreciate
Nice
it.
to
Yeah,
meet you.
nice to meet you.
And thank you for
Yeah,
bringing us all together.
Yeah, no, it was very useful. Are you gonna be around?
I'll be here for the whole conference, but after Ms. Brooks' remarks, I've got to race to the airport.
Got it.
But
Okay.
let me give you my card.
Yeah, same.
I'd love to stay in touch.
I actually teach at the University of Washington
Oh.
Law School, but quite different subject. I teach climate change law.
Oh, all right. Terrific. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, pleasure.
Am I right that I saw that you not only moved it to the recycling bin, but emptied the recycling bin?
I am not sure. I saw that. Maybe Madison did that. Yeah, it looks like that's what was.
Was that Madison sitting there?
Yeah, that was
Oh,
Madison.
okay.
The tall guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he did that. All right.
All right.
Good.
So, if you remember, there's the interview.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well-
So, got about 15 minutes. Maybe get a cup of coffee, and then I'll come find you.
Okay. I think we'll get started now. Welcome back, and thanks again for that excellent first panel, and thanks for to Lara for moderating that panel and overseeing such a productive discussion on the U.S. issues. I think the goal of this conference is to kind of now take what we understand about the U.S. policies toward privacy, civil liberties, and anti-terrorism, and begin to listen now to how other countries approach it. And we will begin to possibly better understand how the U.S. can be a leader, what policies the U.S. is leading in, and how the rest of the world begins to either pursue its own policies or begins to pursue its policies taking into account what it hears and understands about the United States. So again, thanks so much to our panelists for laying that groundwork. And we're going to move now to our second panel, and we're going to be looking at two countries and a region. We'll look at Russia and Turkey, and then we're going to turn to the EU and some specific countries within the EU, but kind of a broader European response, and see how that dovetails or interacts with US and other global standards. So, as was mentioned, you should have gotten the biographies of everybody, so I'm not going to read the whole bio, but simply give the highlight so that we can move along. So our first speaker is Maria Kravchenko, who is director of the Sova Center for... What?
I'm not director.
You're not director. She's been demoted already. She'll tell you what she is. But she is a leading authority on issues of privacy, and my understanding is that she has, in fact, written all the reports or contributed significantly to the reports at the Sova Center for Information and Analysis, which deals with questions about privacy in Russia. So, Maria, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for an opportunity to speak to the audience. Well, I work for Sova Center for Information and Analysis in Moscow. It is a non-profit organization founded in 2002, which focuses on nationalism and racism, relations between religious organizations, the state and secular society in Russia, and on misuse of anti-extremism policies. And I'm responsible for the center's misuse of anti-extremism board. Russia's counter-terrorism framework includes a federal counter-terrorism law and a range of other laws, including criminal, administrative, and criminal procedure norms. The federal law on counteracting terrorism defines terrorism as carrying out of an explosion, arson, or other actions intimidating the population and creating the threat of human death or of infliction of significant property damage or the onset of other grave consequences for the purpose of influencing the taking of a decision by authorities or international organizations, and also the threat of commission of the said actions for the same purposes. The law includes offenses such as propagating terrorism, disseminating materials that call for engaging in terrorist activity, or include justifications of terrorism. It also includes the offense of carrying out informational and other collaboration with terrorists and in planning of terrorist attacks. Under amendments adopted in 2013, authorities can seize property of terrorists' relatives and other people in close relationship with a person who committed an act of terrorism, including for paying compensation to the victims of a terrorist attack. Suspects can also be prosecuted for participating in terrorist training camps and sentenced to up to 10 years of imprisonment. Prohibited training can include getting knowledge and practical skills during physical and psychological exercises, learning the ways of committing specified crimes, rules of carrying weapons, explosive devices, explosive poison, and other materials dangerous for others. A person can avoid prosecution if he or she informed authorities of a training camp's location, revealed the names of a training camp's participants and organizers, and didn't commit any other crimes. Creating a terrorist community, a sustainable group of people united a priori to commit terrorist activities, prepare and commit one or several terrorist crimes or other crimes, or justify and support terrorism through propaganda is punishable with up to 20 years in prison. participating in a terrorist community is punishable by up to 10 years of imprisonment. In July 2016, one of the Yarovaya pack of laws substantially toughened penalties for a number of crimes of terrorism and extremism. The age of criminal responsibility was lowered for a number of crimes of terrorist nature. The criminal code came to include such a questionable offense as failing to report a terrorism-related crime. Most of these provisions may have a negative impact on freedom of information and expression. Their vague formulation leaves them open to broad and arbitrary interpretation, and therefore to be applied in a manner which violates international standards on freedom of expression. Today, the main field for Russian state's anti-terrorist activity is North Caucasus. Note that Sava Center's monitoring doesn't cover the North Caucasian conflict and is primarily focused on the law enforcement in the peaceful territories. But the North Caucasus should be mentioned here, so I will cite reports by Human Rights Watch and International Crisis Group. The North Caucasus is the region for perpetual unrest since the time of the Chechen Wars, where Islamist militant groups affiliated to the Caucasian Emirate committed lethal attacks against state officials, law enforcement, and security forces and civilians. Like any government, Russia is obliged to investigate and prosecute such crimes. However, counterinsurgency operations in the republics of North Caucasus, such as Dagestan or Chechnya, involve sweep, search, and seizure raids of homes, neighborhoods, or entire villages aimed at capturing insurgents and seizing weapons. Although such operations may have a lawful basis and legitimate purpose, the manner in which they are conducted, including in particular the resort to force against civilians and the abuse of detention powers, indicate persistent disregard for human rights standards. International Crisis Group points out that the unresolved conflict, often unaccountable and non-transparent governance, poor socio-economic conditions, and a deep sense of injustice and despair contribute to religious radicalization of the young in Caucasus. As a result of the government's disproportionately harsh methods, they join ranks of insurgents in the Caucasus or go abroad to fight for ISIS. Before the Olympic Games in Sochi, the Russian authorities didn't prevent the local radicals from going to Syria. Then the policy changed. From the second half of 2014, hundreds of recruiters and volunteers of ISIS have been prosecuted for terrorism. According to International Crisis Group, credibility of recruitment charges is hard to establish. Given the prevalence of torture, suspects' testimony often allows reasonable doubt as to whether the accused is a recruiter or just shares radical ideology. The security services focus on quantitative results as the main criteria for performance evaluation, encourages police to inflate their successes. Moreover, most recruiters are reportedly based outside Russia, in Europe or Turkey, so unreachable. Meanwhile, the pressure on Salafis, whom the local authorities and the Sufi pro-governmental religious majority blame on propagating joining the ISIS ranks, though there are different Salafi communities in North Caucasus, including non-violent ones. And raids on Salafi mosques and mass arrests of associated believers have become part of a systematic policy aimed at closing or fully controlling the mosques in Dagestan and Chechnya, where many believers detained in 2015 and some disappeared late in the year. One of Yarovaya's pack of amendments was supposedly intended against Salafi preaching. It substantially restricts missionary work. The amendments essentially make it possible to issue a fine for any religious action not authorized by an officially registered religious association. As International Crisis Group points out, the affected Salafi who were not involved in violence previously are pushed by all of these methods towards joining the insurgents. Russian enforcement do not distinguish clearly between extremism and terrorism threats. Both extremist and terrorist activities are often investigated by the same law enforcement agencies, by police e-centers for fighting extremism or FSB, Federal Security Service. There are certain ideological or technical criteria applied. Terrorism is all about Islamists or explosives. So a neo-Nazi gang using explosives are terrorists, but those killing a federal judge are not, although the murder was obviously aimed at public intimidation and pressing the authorities. We should note that the Russian authorities applied anti-terrorist laws to their opponents in the Crimea in the case of Alexei Sentsov and Alexander Korchenko. The accusations against them lack proper evidence and could be interpreted under other articles of criminal code. But anti-terrorist articles were suitable to show the public that the Crimean opposition is a source of public threat and to give the defendants long prison terms. Common sense tells us that terrorism must be distinguished from extremism basing on the level of threat, but it is not. The fate of Hizb ut-Tahrir political party is the best illustration. Hizb ut-Tahrir is a radical Islamist organization which is mainly preoccupied with propaganda. According to Hizb's ideology, the only rule must be Allah's will and the Sharia laws exercised through a rightly elected caliph. The future caliphate, as in the times of the rightful caliphs, must be single and all-encompassing without national states or federations, a totalitarian state ruled exclusively by Sharia's laws. The establishment of such caliphate, ultimately to cover the entire world, is the goal of Hizb. Hizb regards actions which are almost unanimously described as terrorism as legitimate guerrilla actions, for while being at war, the entire population of enemy countries is involved in supporting a war against Muslims. The party's texts also contain anti-Semitist and anti-Israeli propaganda, which can undoubtedly be regarded as inciting hatred. However, Hizb avoids direct calls to action addressed to its members. We believe that this radical Islamist organization is an extremist group, but not a terrorist one. The party was established in 1953 and since then developed predominantly in the Arabic Middle East, where it had hoped through its preaching to inspire Muslims to rebuild the caliphate. They rejected the methods of conspiracy and rebellion common in the region. Hizb's opposition to Arabic governments resulted in universal and cruel suppression. No regime in the region was prepared to tolerate radical criticism. Since then, Hizb has spread over the Muslim world, entering the post-Soviet Central Asia and Russian regions with important Muslim population. In Central Asia, Hizb, alongside other Islamic movements, was at its most visible in Uzbekistan and was subjected as part of political opposition to tough repression by Karimov's regime. His members and suspected supporters have been arrested, sentenced to long prison terms, and often tortured. Uzbek authorities blame Hizb for organizing the unrest in Andijan in May 2005 and a series of terrorist attacks in previous years. However, it is well known that the Andijan events were organized by a different group, Arkamia. There is no sound evidence of Hizb's involvement in any other terrorist attacks in Uzbekistan. Nevertheless, thousands of people were persecuted and many fled to other countries, including Russia. In Russia, promotion of Hizb ideology encountered a similar reaction of authorities, although there was much less cruelty due to obvious differences between the political regimes. After 2001, Uzbek members of Hizb were extradited to Uzbekistan, and in 2003, arrests and trials started in Russia, first against nationals of Central Asian countries and later against local Russians. During 10 years, charges against them were most often brought under Article 282.2, that is, taking part in extremist organization. After the 2013 and 2016 amendments to anti-terrorist legislation were made, followers of Hizb ut-Tahrir face the most active prosecution as members of a terrorist organization under Article 205 and 5 of the Criminal Code. This year, 9 sentences against 24 followers of Hizb ut-Tahrir were issued and become increasingly severe. For example, 2 out of the 3 Hizb ut-Tahrir followers convicted in August in St. Petersburg received 17 and 16 years in a maximum security colony. At least 15 more such criminal cases, 10 of them in Tatarstan, against at least 34 people were opened in January-August 2016. We should stress that those people were only charged of their party's propaganda and not of organizing any terrorist acts, and they received prison terms usually given for serial murders. We believe all of this may lead to another wave of radicalization of Muslim youth. The story of Hizb shows one of the main problems in the field of counterterrorism and counter-extremism law enforcement in Russia, which is lack of competent expert opinion. Russian authorities base on the opinion of experts who fail to tell terrorists from suspicious groups and suspicious groups from peaceful ones. For example, Nurkala, a purely phantom religious organization, was banned as extremist, though it had never even existed. Numerous books by Turkish theologian Said Nursi that posed no danger were banned, and then Nurkala, only existing in the heads of some of the special services personnel in fear of contemporary pan-Turkism, was deemed extremist. We should also mention a ban on Tablighi Jamaat movement. This movement was banned in Russia as extremist, despite the fact that it is engaged exclusively with promotion of the Islamic religious practices and has never been known to incite violence. Those bans were imposed by the courts due to vague wording of the Russian law on fighting extremism that makes it possible to prosecute individuals and organizations for inciting religious hate or religious discord, even if it is not associated with violence or calls to violence and discrimination. The definition of extremism in the law includes propaganda of the exceptional nature, superiority, or deficiency of persons on the basis of their attitude to religion. Banning books and other materials of religious groups on the basis of propaganda of the exceptional nature, superiority, or deficiency of persons on the basis of their attitude to religion is a rather easy and quick procedure for Russian courts, which tend to rely entirely on expert opinions, regardless of their quality, which is often poor. The publisher of the material in question, in most cases, is not even informed of the court's proceedings on the matter. No wonder the federal list of extremist materials now contains nearly 4,000 items. Among those items, there are hundreds of Muslim religious materials, including highly authoritative religious literature. After a material is banned as extremist, the web pages containing it can be blocked without a court's ruling, and the whole websites can be banned by courts. So dozens of Muslims are fined every year for distribution of banned literature, or even keeping it with the intent of distribution. Among them, there are common believers, booksellers, but also imams and sometimes even muftis. Such cases happen the more often the longer the federal list of extremism material gets, because it is a problem to scroll through it. Banning materials published or distributed by a religious organization is often the first step towards the ban of organization itself. After an organization is banned as extremist, any of its members can be prosecuted for organizing activities of an organization banned for extremism or participation in it. An individual can be fined, sent to compulsory labor, or go to prison. People who are even suspected of involvement in extremist or terrorist activities are listed in a special document by Rosfin Monitoring State Financial Agency and face harsh restrictions on using their bank accounts and cards. The anti-extremist system affects not only Muslims, but a much more wide circle of believers, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, Protestants, Hare Krishnas, and other adepts of non-traditional for Russia religious groups, including even atheists. As other Russian citizens, for example, civil activists and political opponents of the regime, they may face prosecution for inciting hate under Article 282 of the Criminal Code. Note that according to Russian law on extremism, humiliation of human dignity can also be rated as inciting hate. While considering cases under this article, courts do not take into account such substantial criteria as the context of a statement in question, its potential audience, and potential threat to the public security. So many people are sentenced for inciting hate, for making statements which do not even deserve attention of the law enforcement. The situation when wide circles of people sharing their opinions are treated by the state as posing threat to the stability and public security eliminates the possibility of public discussion and leads to tensions and open conflicts. However, the Russian state is not ready to improve the legislation and law enforcement and to engage competent experts to change the trend from further radicalization to a dialogue.
Thank you very much, Maria. I now like to turn the floor over to Henri Barkey, who is head of our Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. And I'm very grateful that the Middle East program has co-sponsored today's event as well. So, Henri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. Let me just say, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm a political scientist, so I will approach the subject a little bit from a perspective of the general developments in Turkey. The best way to describe the conditions that we are seeing now in Turkey is basically to say it's a great unraveling of civil liberties in Turkey following the July 15th attempted coup that failed. The government immediately introduced emergency law, which for 3 months, and it has just renewed it. But in the first 3 months, just to give you a few statistics, so they have arrested over 120 journalists in jail. There's 40,000 people who have been arrested that have yet to see a judge. 32 people have, in addition, another 32,000 people have been remanded to custody. 932 private schools, 15 universities were closed. 1,225 associations, 18 television stations, 45 newspapers, 23 radio stations, 35 hospitals, 3 news agencies, and 15 periodicals were all banned in the space of 3 months. So what you're seeing is essentially a wholesale attack on essentially all types of free expression. In fact, today, when you look at the Turkish press, 90% of the press is either under the direct control of the government, i.e. they are owned by people who are associated or relatives of members of the government or the president, or they've been intimidated to such an extent that they just parrot what the government wants them to say. So you really do not have any opening, any free expression. The question is this really unusual? I think what I would argue today is that it is unusual in the extent and especially in post, shall we say, Cold War era. But there are precedents to that in modern Turkish history, and I'll come back to that and also talk about the conception of how the state essentially approaches the concept of civil liberties and excuse me, and also how does it deal with acts of terrorism and terrorist groups. But as I start, let me just say that let me put some context into this. So what happened on July 15th? On July 15th, there was an attempted coup that was defeated. It turns out probably because the government managed to found out about it and took precautionary actions, and the coup kind of fizzled out with many of the officers who probably were going to be part of it changing their mind. Nonetheless, the government essentially said that this coup was organized by one person and one person only, a relatively aging religious person who happens to live in Pennsylvania by the name of Fethullah Gulen. And so now they have essentially passed a law that says that there is an organization called FETO, F-E-T-O, which is a officially designated terrorist organization. And so all of these arrests, all of these closures of newspapers and universities are all in the context of essentially this new terrorist designation for this organization. So who's Mr. Gulen? Mr. Gulen is essentially this religious guy who created a network. In Turkey, there's always been religious movements that, especially under the more radical, I should say, radical secularist regime of that Atatürk had created, these religious organizations essentially existed just underneath the radar, organized surreptitiously, and the state, while not tolerating it, did not necessarily always go after them. But so this was a way for people who were pious to get together, share ideas, read books that some of which were banned, including Said Nursi, as you mentioned earlier, and Mr. Gulen is a follower of Said Nursi. So, but following the rise of Mr. Erdogan in the elections of 2002, and he's coming to power in 2003, the system, the Turkish political system and legal system kind of opened itself up. It opened itself up in a way in which all of these religious organizations emerged, and in general, between 2003 and 2007, you see a real opening of the Turkish political system in which people who would go to jail for uttering simple things now could say whatever they want. A whole bunch of newspapers, radio stations, etc., emerged. But what's interesting, of course, is that Mr. Erdogan's party and Mr. Erdogan's followers did not have the cadres that were necessary to run the state. I mean, they came to power having been denied essentially access to power because the state always purged the religious elements from its ranks. They don't have the cadres. And he turned to Mr. Gulen, who had already come to the United States because he was looking for refuge from the military, which was trying to get him arrested. So he turned to Mr. Gulen, who had the cadres. Why did Mr. Gulen have the cadres? Because his particular Islamist organization privileged or emphasized education. And an education which was essentially education based on science, on math, on learning languages, and so on and so forth. He had created this network of schools all throughout Turkey and also abroad. So he had the cadres that Erdogan needed to run the state, because Erdogan could not trust the secular state's functionaries. So he needed to bring new people. So you had an alliance between Mr. Gulen and Mr. Erdogan that lasted essentially until 2012. It was a very lucrative, shall we say, politically lucrative alliance for the two of them. Mr. Gulen never went back to Turkey, but you know, it was very clear of the cooperation that they had. But in the process, Gulen and his organization really did take over certain parts of the Turkish bureaucracy. I shouldn't say infiltrated. They were invited in. They took advantage of it. But so you saw a great deal of judges, prosecutors, who were part of the movement, assume important positions in the Turkish bureaucracy. Similarly, elsewhere also. And Mr. Gulen and Mr. Erdogan, for the most part, agreed on just about everything, except at one point there was a separation or a split. And the split occurred over how to approach the Kurdish question. Until then, the Kurdish question was seen purely as a terrorist the the Kurds in Turkey have always rebelled. The last rebellion started in 1984 and continues to this day. But it is a rebellion for which there is no military solution. So Erdogan decided to seek and look for, to his credit, look for a political solution. But Gülen was ferociously anti-Kurdish. I mean, he sees himself as a conservative Turkish nationalist and did not tolerate. So once this started, you see, for example, that the judges and the prosecutors affiliated with Gülen start all kinds of campaign against Kurds, and they start arresting Kurds, leading members of the Kurdish community, lawyers, professors, and with really absurd, very absurd charges. I mean, I know one particular lawyer I took a great deal of interest. He was, for example, charged for being a member of the PKK, a terrorist organization, and the evidence was that he was in a demonstration in the town of Diyarbakir, and somebody at the very back, and there were 5,000 people, somebody at the very back of the demonstration opened up a PKK flag, therefore you are a PKK member. He spent 4.5 years in jail without trial. So the Gülenists were had their own ideas. I mean, and they were following Gülen's more Gülen than the Turkish government. But the split eventually became very acute when effectively you had two very powerful people in Turkey, and the country was not big enough for the two, if you want. And so the two split in 2013. There was all kinds of allegations against Mr. Erdogan and his ministers of graft and etc. And from then on, you see an effort by Erdogan to essentially prosecute all the members of the Gülen organization, but he was going slowly. The coup has essentially enabled him to now go full speed ahead. But the problem is when you look at all those people who have been arrested, or the newspapers that have been closed, or associations that have been closed, they have gone essentially. They've taken this notion of being a Gülenist very, very widely, and they have gone essentially after all their opponents. There's one journalist, for example, he's a professor of economics and also a journalist, and he was arrested some 5 weeks ago now on the charge that he was sending subliminal messages on a television show the day before the coup. Right? I mean, there is no rhyme, no reason. I mean, unfortunately, I know a lot of people who are in jail, and none of them were members of the Gülen organizations. I've known them very well for a long time. But they were all opponents of Mr. Erdogan. So he's using this now to completely clean, in his mind, society, and also purge the government of Gülen, not just Gülen supporters, but all kinds of critics. So it is a very unusual time. But let me just talk a little bit about the terrorist threat in Turkey and also how the state has essentially approached historically. There are terrorist organizations. The PKK, for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which started in 1984, really started as a terrorist organization, attacking both Kurds and Turkish civilians until it essentially organized itself, solidified. But it is a nationalist organization, and now today has a great deal of support and has essentially abandoned terrorism, but occasionally it does engage in attacking civilians, or groups affiliated with it attack civilians. But it is an organization that is deemed terrorist by the United States, by the European Union, and of course by Turkey. Nonetheless, the Turkish government between 2013 and 2015 actually negotiated with the leader of the PKK, who happens to be in jail in an island in the Marmara Sea, and they actually went very far in terms of agreeing to a roadmap, which Erdogan eventually disowned because of what was happening in Syria, and not really because of the nature of the negotiations. Nonetheless, he has now turned on the Kurdish community once again. But so the PKK is one of them. But you also have ISIS, and ISIS, paradoxically, ISIS in Turkey, I should say, is a product of government policy that essentially allowed and encouraged all kinds of jihadists to come from Europe and elsewhere in the world to go into Syria, because that's what the Turkish government thought was going to ultimately undo Mr. Assad in Syria. And the jihadists who were coming were not coming with ISIS cards. I mean, they were coming to Turkey, sometimes going for other organizations in Syria, but in the process, a network of ISIS supporters, and including many Turks, formed a serious threat to the state. And now the state is in a position where it has to dismantle these networks. But there is a great deal of support among, not a great deal, I should say, I shouldn't exaggerate. There is some support and significant networks, though, that support ISIS. You also have other terrorist groups. So you've always had leftist, fringe leftist groups, Trotskyites, Stalinist, you name it, who have engaged in occasional terrorism, sometimes grave, sometimes very small. And you also have Islamist terrorists who have essentially targeted Kurds, but they are Kurdish Islamists who attack the pro-PKK Kurds. So you have a whole mix of things. But fundamentally, in Turkey, the state has always approached the issue of, has always conflated terrorism with freedom of speech. So which means that anything you say can be interpreted as a terrorist threat. And in many ways, I always say Turkish justice is to justice what military music is to music. So you have a semblance of, when in these issues, you have a semblance of a justice system. But people get prosecuted, sent to jail purely on the basis of who they are and whether they are perceived to be a long-term threat. This is not new. This has always existed in Turkish jurisprudence, and so the approach that the Turks have taken to terrorism has always been one of going after all kinds of expressions of support for causes that they don't agree. And in the last 3 decades, it has really been the Kurdish question, because the Kurdish question is the single most important threat to Turkey. I mean, you have approximately 20% of the population which is Kurdish. They don't all necessarily want a Kurdish state, but they do want certain rights which they have been denied all these years. And today, the paradox, of course, is that today people talk about the Kurdish issue in Turkey. The only reason they talk about it, let's face it, is because in 1984 you had the emergence of the PKK as a very violent organization that did publicize, popularize, and also gathered enormous amount of support among Kurdish populations in Turkey's southeast and eastern provinces. So whereas the state now admits that there is a Kurdish problem, sometimes. Erdogan the other day said there is no Kurdish problem in Turkey after he had been negotiating with the Kurds. That has been the great fear of the Turks. So because of that, they have essentially not succeeded in transitioning, if you want, to a justice or a judicial system that can distinguish between free speech and violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Henri. Our final speaker is Melissa Hooper, who is Director of Human Rights and Civil Society at Human Rights First. Melissa.
Great. Okay, there we go. So thanks very much to the Wilson Center and the Jackson Foundation for putting this together. As a rule of law geek, I admire the work of both organizations, and I've been fascinated by the panel, so thank you very much. Also, as a rule of law geek, I'm going to be talking a bit about the EU, and I'd like to draw the connection between the anti-terror laws and processes that are being developed in the EU now, and especially in Hungary and Poland and some of the countries, and an anti-constitutionalism and the anti-migrant sentiment that is being fomented there. And I want to posit at the end that I think that, that what we're calling the migrant problem also should maybe instead be called a nationalism problem. And the problem is really the reaction to migrants coming into Europe, and also an EU sentiment that is being fomented that is allowing some governments to grab more power. And I'll talk about some of those examples today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Hungary and Poland, and then try to contrast with France. And that's 3 countries, and I've got 15 minutes. And so I'll do the best that I can, and maybe we'll go back a little bit afterwards. So in Hungary, you have a prime minister who comes in, Viktor Orbán, and what are some of the early things that are going on? You have this migration crisis going on, and he has been using that. And so some of the backdrop for the anti-terror laws in Hungary is a great deal of anti-migrant and Islamophobic sentiment. You have billboards that have been put up that say things like, "Did you know that since the beginning of the migration crisis, more than 300 people have died in terrorist attacks," kind of trying to draw a connection between terrorism and migrants. And also saying that since the beginning of the migration crisis, harassment against women has increased dramatically. Now, I know that they're just pulling that out. They're not referring to studies. And that also the Paris attacks were carried out by migrants, which isn't true. So they're using disinformation, this new tool that I think that Orbán may be learning a bit from his friends in Russia. You also have, ahead of the referendum, people probably heard about the Hungary referendum that asked citizens whether they thought the EU should be governing Hungary's migration policy. That was just declared invalid because they didn't have enough votes. Enough voters going to the polls in the beginning of October. Ahead of that, you have this 18-page booklet that has been sent out to 4.1 million households that, again, equates migrants with terrorists, and also declares that the EU has unsafe zones where governments cannot control the migrant population, and so therefore you have there are places where you as Hungarians should not go, and they include London, Paris, and Berlin, because they're unsafe. Their governments can't control them. And the implicit message is, so we in Hungary have to create more control, so you have to give us more power. So guess what's been happening? You have a great constitutional changes in Hungary that happened around 2011, 2012, that changed parts of the constitution, also significantly changed the constitutional court, which is, I think, really key, and hamstrung it and removed a bunch of judges. They used things like new retirement requirements and things like that. And so you have a new constitutional court that is much more amenable to what Orbán thinks. In addition, you have in the summer of 2015, Parliament is amending all of these statutes to declare that a state of crisis can be caused by mass migration. Now, prior to this, a state of crisis could only be declared in 5 other really serious circumstances. So they've created this new tool. What are they going to do? Immediately, they start using it. That's where you see the state of crisis declared in later 2015 and the construction of the fence. So the fence, once Hungary declares that there is a state of crisis because of migration, they decide that they can construct this fence between Hungary and Serbia to try to keep out migrants. And this is where another theme that I would like to point out, you see the creation of something illegal made legal. And so they are trying to say that people who are coming to the country legally, many of whom are refugees and have a right to flee, they start to brand them as terrorists and say that they are illegally entering the country. So they create these transit zones around the fence. And so those that are entering the transit zone are said to be not entering Hungary, they're entering the transit zone, which reminds me a little bit of what the US has done. There are references in immigration law to, exclusion laws that say, oh, even though you've come, we have to first declare you legally in the United States. So They also created what they call safe countries of origin, and they label countries such as Macedonia, Serbia, Greece safe countries so that anyone who comes from those countries can be sent back because they've come from a safe country. So within 2 days of the construction of this fence, you see the number of migrants coming into Hungary decrease from 6,000 to a few dozen. But more significantly, you see the prosecutions of people who are trying to get into Hungary. So then people who are fleeing violence are now being prosecuted for their attempts to flee, and they're also in some cases being beaten. By the end of 2015, after the fence was constructed, which is about 3 months of fence, you have 900 people prosecuted for illegal border crossings. And so then you also start to see prosecution of some migrants, including Syrian refugees, for terrorism offenses. There's a trial going on now of 11 migrants who are trying to cross, and they were charged with the crime of inciting a crowd to attack Hungary by trying to enter the country. This is going on right now. And then just after that, so then now we're in 2016, and in 2016 we see yet again an amendment to the Constitution. And this amendment allows that a state of terrorist threat can be declared if there's a 2/3 vote of the parliament, and it increases, again, the power of the government. So you have, bans on mass events, reinforced border protections. They can actually employ the use of the military within Hungary's borders, which was not legal before. And related to the encryption discussion, it allows or requires service providers of communications technology to offer encrypted information to police. So we're starting to get into, this examining what other countries are doing. I think Russia is really pushing this with the Yarovaya law, and I think that's where Hungary is getting it, really. Significantly, you have, one of the spokesmen from the government saying, what we're passing here is mild in comparison to what is available to authorities in France or the United States. So they really do look at what other countries are doing, and what the US does really does matter. So how is the EU responding in Hungary? Well, unfortunately, while you had countries like Luxembourg and Sweden saying we really need to take action, or the EU really needs to take action, especially in Luxembourg, they said, they're treating refugees worse than wild animals, we should consider just kicking them out. But there's no procedure for kicking them out. Whoops, sorry. But there is something called, Article 7, and Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union does say that there can be sanctions for a country that is not essentially following the values of the European Union as set out in Article 2. And those values are the kinds of things that you might expect. Article 2, the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for minorities, etc. It's these things that you would expect. And so there was finally a proposal to threaten Hungary under Article 7 in October of last year, but it was rejected. It was brought to a committee of the EU, and the committee rejected it, and when asked, they said, well, the bar is high for the eventual sanctions that would be imposed under Article 7, and we just knew that it wouldn't happen. So we decided to not start. It's a very, I think, strange form of reasoning. What's going on, I think part of what's going on is that they do fear that the perception of EU interference in a country is going to cause a huge backlash. There is a prior example of sanctions that were imposed on Austria after the Freedom Party came to power in 2000. And the EU said, basically said, your values are not commensurate with our values, and they sanctioned Austria. It was not under Article 7, but another kind of diplomatic sanctions. And there was a huge uproar and a backlash, and the EU, in a hurry, created a new council to review what was going on in Hungary and say, review what was going on in Austria and say, okay, we're reducing or eliminating the sanctions. And so I think that they are worried about that backlash. There's also, after that process, they did create a preventative mechanism, the rule of law mechanism, which you're now seeing applied in Poland. So it's not just sanctions, but you actually have a warning mechanism. And now I think that they're recognizing that they need to do further work on this, and the EU is creating this pact on democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights, which would be an annual review of each country in the EU by independent experts, so not by the EU itself, which I think is going in the right direction, but for countries like Hungary and Poland, probably going to be too little too late. And so final piece about Hungary is how is it reacting to all of this? Well, we have a new constitutional amendment. This is almost comical, where they're now citing that their constitutional identity governs what happens in Hungary. And these are kind of code words that say that our local courts will determine how our laws apply, not EU courts. So they're trying to insulate themselves from EU power. And after all of this, you kind of wonder why Hungary wants to stay in the EU, but guess what? I think it does, and that has to do with economics and with the political power that it can get. So, you know, I think that my recommendation is that the EU keep pushing, but I do think that it's really difficult, and that Hungary is presenting a huge problem for the EU, and that if Hungary keeps getting its way, that the EU will see more countries starting to push. One of those countries is Poland. Poland has been experiencing similar problems in terms of anti-migrant and Islamophobic sentiment. You have a march into late 2015 where thousands of Poles were chanting things like, "Today refugees, tomorrow terrorists," and "Poland, free of Islam." Poland has, for the last couple of years, seen an exorbitant increase in instances of hate that are being documented, and this is a little bit interesting because you don't see a real influx of refugees into Poland. Poland is at its Belarus-Poland border, again, like Hungary, blocking refugees and just sending people back. And so they're not creating laws about it, they're not talking about it, they're just preventing people from coming in. So Poland, similar to Hungary, started when you have the new Law and Justice Party comes in October. The first thing they do is they change the rules relating to the Constitutional Court, very similar to Hungary. They refused to seat some of the judges that were supposed to be put on from the last government, civic platform, and then they changed the rules in such a way that essentially the court cannot hear new cases for a couple of years. They basically changed the sequencing of how the court is allowed to hear cases and say that it has to hear its entire backlog before it can hear any new cases, no matter how important they are. So this means that the court won't really be able to review new laws. And so it's after that that they start passing new police laws and new anti-terror laws. I think notably they use an accelerated procedure for all of these, introduction of these laws. Some of them are introduced late at night, and they aren't consulting civil society. They're getting, pushed through in a secret procedures and in very short periods of time. So you have things like, the new police law is allowing very, very broad surveillance on individuals to over 10 police agencies and paramilitary groups as well. The broad surveillance is allowed without any judicial review, and it allows, video recording, audio recording, metadata, which is the long list of items that Robin, I think, spoke of this morning. So it provides a lot of information to the Polish law enforcement. And that's just one law. Then you have the anti-terror law, which has declared all foreign nationals to be terror suspects. So that means whenever I visit Poland, which I've done several times this year, I'm considered a terrorist suspect. And what that means is that all of my information can be searched, and all of my emails and phone calls, and it's very broad surveillance. And this is very worrisome to some NGOs that I've been working with, because they were contacted just as the law was being put into place and asked by the police, do you have any foreign nationals working for you? And they're worried because that means that they can be surveilled because their foreign nationals are being surveilled at work. And so that leaks into their work. Other provisions include arrest based on reasonable suspicion or a probability that someone was going to commit a terrorist act, so it's a probability in the future. There can be declared states of alarm that limit assembly and restrictions on freedom of communication. So the EU got a clue and responded to Poland and instituted the rule of law framework preventative mechanism in January, and then formalized it finally in July. So by July 27th, they gave Poland 3 months to clean up its act and respond to some of the challenges that were observed by the EU. These are all related to rule of law. They don't talk about the anti-terrorism laws or any of this. And I think because their concern is that if there is no mechanism, no court that can review Poland's laws, then there is no check on the government's power. And I think that that's why they're concerned about the Constitutional Tribunal, and their focus is there. And I think they should be. I think that that's where you're going to see the change, and that's clearly where Hungary and Poland are trying to focus it. But I think that they're getting this power because their citizens are allowing them to have it, and so that's why I think there needs to be attention focused on trying to interact with and reduce the nationalism in both countries. Switching quickly to France and how, what's going on in France and how it's a little bit different, or, how the EU is responding, which is it's not. France has this state of emergency, and I think that's the big issue that you see developing in France. France was not an angel when it comes to anti-terror laws before all of the terrorist acts that happened in 2015 and in 2016. It had some laws that prohibited inciting terrorism or glorifying terrorism, these really broad statements about prevention of terrorism and allowing some surveillance to prevent terrorism, things like that. But I think that those were instituted mostly in the late 2000s, 2012, 2014. So again, I think they're looking toward the U.S. and what the U.S. has been doing. But it's really after January 2015 and the Charlie Hebdo events that you see France expanding surveillance and seeing very expansive surveillance laws based on their concerns about terrorism. And then, unfortunately, you have the November 2015 Paris and Saint-Denis attacks, where you had the state of emergency declared and very expansive targeting of Muslims. So when the state of emergency is declared, it was only, it lasts for 12 days under the initial law, and then the parliament votes, and they're allowed to extend it for 3 months. Unfortunately, in July, just after, hours after President Hollande announced the state of emergency is going to sunset, because if we keep it, we will no longer be a republic. You have the Nice attacks, and then Hollande says, okay, state of emergency for 3 more months. And then the opposition says, how about 6? And so now you have a state of emergency in France going until January 7th, 2017. And the problem with that is I think of the state of emergency as something like, a fight or flight response. You're trying to marshal all of your efforts to deal with what's right in front of you. And the deal with a fight or flight response is your cortex floods with hormones and your executive functioning stops working, so you can just respond. So as you extend the state of emergency for months and months, again, France's executive functioning is impaired because they are passing laws with an accelerated review time, and they're trying to respond to a situation right in front of them when they're not taking the time to consider whether it's effective. And in fact, there was a French commission held this summer that reviewed the state of emergency, and their conclusion was that it has only had a limited impact on improving security. So, quick notes on what has happened in France as a response. You have targeting of mostly Muslims increasing hugely. You have, complaints of hundreds of abusive house arrests, prohibition and house arrests for protesters, environmental protesters, labor protesters, so many. And again, the EU hasn't responded. The Council of Europe has, expressed concern. Why is this? I think because France has a constitutional court. They have not hampered their judicial system, and they have not hampered their media in ways that you have seen in Hungary and Poland. And so, as I said, I think that the real concern is this anti-Muslim sentiment that is being brought about by nationalism and anti-EU sentiment in all countries, because in France you have the Front National who is promoting this, so I think that that's where there needs to be targeting. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I'm going to get to the audience as soon as I can because I know you've been very patient this morning, but I do want to kind of ask one question, and I'll ask it to Henri and to Melissa. And the question is, having listened to all the presentations today, and we've talked trying to seek the source of comparison or comparative perspective, is all anti-terrorism legislation local? In other words, is it always responding to a specific domestic need? And that is what is driving kind of the questions of the legislation that they implement in terms of the responses, in terms of going after freedom of press or going after people who are believed to be in opposition. When we were looking to see if there's something comparative in order to look at civil liberties and balancing anti-terrorism legislation, and to what extent does the U.S. serve as an example or can serve as an example. But based on your presentations, one gets the impression that no matter what country you go to, they're responding to specific domestic issues. So to what extent then is anti-terrorism legislation simply a response to domestic realities?
But I don't understand, as opposed to a foreign threat?
Not supposed to a foreign threat, to the extent that it's looking for other examples, or looking to see how the United States deals with questions of privacy or watch lists, or the things that we talked about in our first panel. To what extent is that really a concern for these countries as they approach the question of balancing civil liberties? In other words, is it simply a continuum of a tradition that you talked about, Henri, or to what extent is there a global debate on these issues?
Oh, I would say, I mean, there's no question that the Turks always point to the French example, saying, look, the French have a state of emergency. Why are you, I mean, we had a coup, why are you questioning that? But the problem is that there was never really a real freedom real civil liberties in Turkey in the first place. Mm-hmm. So it's not like in France you have still the constitutional code, you still have a tradition of civil liberties. In Turkey you've never had that tradition. And in fact, I would argue this is essentially going back to the factory settings. And it is in that sense domestic. But in Turkey is different in the sense that I don't think it ever believed in civil liberties in the way we understand civil liberties. But hey, look, they also point to Guantanamo. I mean, it's not...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree that you see in a number of countries when laws are passed, they're looking to see, well, where they've been passed before, and if they can find something similar in the U.S. or maybe France, they will cite it. And I think that in terms of an international debate or conversation, I do think that once something happened in France, it came to France, and so then they joined the discussion, but before that there hadn't been as much of a grappling with it, perhaps. I do think that one way there does need to be more of an international debate is there needs to be engagement between different countries. Like France has been concerned with the state of emergency trying to respond to the events in France, but there are a number of indications that some of the perpetrators of the events in France had been found in other parts of the EU, but that they didn't have mechanisms for knowing that and being able to identify people and communicate across countries. And Jennifer Daskell was talking this morning about sharing information across countries, and I think that that's where there does need to be more focus and discussion.
Let's open the floor to questions. Laura. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Well, one of the themes that I heard a little bit this morning, and then I'm hearing a little bit this afternoon, and also relates to the United States today, is that the issue of terrorism is being conflated with the problem of refugees and migrants, and so we see that to an extent in Russia, but certainly in Poland, where they're somewhat making it up, and in Hungary, and there are issues that are relevant to Turkey and obviously the United States. So that seems to be a precursor to public concerns and pushback and maybe an instigation of some extremism that we're seeing. Would you agree with that?
Wholeheartedly, yeah. I do think that what we're seeing in the EU with concerns over, migrants are and refugees are terrorists is something that I think it connects into this larger question that anti-EU people raise about whether the government can protect you and whether this, whether the EU, this larger entity, whether it can protect you. And I think part of that is the anti-EU people saying, with all these foreigners coming in, they're bringing in foreign ideas and foreign ways, and it's diluting our liberalism and diluting our culture, and that is itself a risk. And I do think that you see that a little bit in the US too, that there are certain elements of that creeping into discourse here, yes.
Right here.
Hi, Jim Michael. I'm a consultant and generally interested in the subject matter. This panel has a title of Strategies, International Strategies. And I find myself somewhat depressed by what I'm hearing, which is that nationalism is inhibiting a climate for international discourse on coming up with some commonalities of approach or commonalities of standards. And that while, Poland or Hungary may cite what they do in France or what they do in Guantanamo, if they didn't have that example, I don't know that it would change what they're doing. They might find something else to cite. But it's essentially an inward-looking kind of a politics that seems to be justifying these dilutions or erosions of civil liberties. And I wonder is there any thought that any of the panelists can provide about how to get moving toward any kind of an international dialogue with a view to a strategy that would set some floor under this? I mean, we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it seems to be honored in the breach in the cases you've described.
So I think that there are kind of two pieces of that. There are short-term responses and there are long-term solutions. And I think part of the problem is that countries are employing short-term responses and they're trying to react to events. And I think that the US has started to learn that really there need to be long-term solutions. And the US has started to focus more, the US government, on the CVE policy, countering violent extremism, which is more about, not to say that the US is always doing it well, but there is a lot of, I think, good rhetoric coming out of Obama and Undersecretary Sarah Sewell talking about how there needs to be more community building and community creating and reaching out to communities and anti-poverty work and youth engagement to try to counter long-term, some of the things that Maria was talking about, try to counter some of the things that end up turning people toward radicalization. And there's a UN strategic plan on countering violent extremism that is bringing together countries to have this discussion. And so I think that there is movement and there's thinking about these larger responses, but that I think that it goes slowly. And I also think that because it produces results in the long term, it's hard to see the results. And so we get antsy and we think we need to do things now.
Right here. Mm-hmm. We're just going to go in the back. So right here, the gentleman in the suit right here. Mm-hmm. Just pass the microphone down to him.
So it seems to me that both in the countries that are being discussed on this panel as well as in the U.S., as we learned with the previous panel, that there's a tension between the rule of law and democracy in some cases. When you have 85% of the public or whatever supports the expansion of surveillance authority, if the people of Hungary support hamstringing the constitutional court, how then do you make an effective argument against these kinds of stretching or even outright violations of the rule of law?
Directed towards the EU, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really tough. I think that's why the EU is trying to say, look, there are certain values that are part of this, our institution. And, there's kind of like a floor below which we cannot go. And unfortunately, I think they let Hungary dive below that floor and they didn't react. And that's why they're reacting with Poland. And I think that they should follow through with what's happening in Poland and probably institute the rule of law procedure against Hungary too. How do you make arguments about that? I think that that's the tough part is, the arguments will come across as to some in Hungary and Poland as interference or as elitist. And I think that that's where the work needs to be done in creating conversations and it's, kind of more grassroots work between the EU and those countries. And that's why I think they're creating this, EU Pact on Democracy, Rule of Law, Fundamental Rights. They recognize that they need to start having more ongoing discussions and conversations and pulling people in. And that's, it needs to be not the EU sweeping in and trying to make changes. But I agree that there is that fundamental tension, and it's these citizens that are voting for this, referenda. You have in Switzerland just last week, they passed a referendum allowing giving police more surveillance powers. And it's a referendum, and so this is now becoming a standard, and
So go ahead, Honor.
You have essentially the same issue between Turkey and the EU. Turkey is supposedly a country that wants to be a member of the European Union, and it's in a way maybe it's easier for the European Union to criticize the Turks than criticizing the Hungarians, but they haven't. And they haven't because of other calculations, because there's probably 1 million refugees who would like to go to Europe, and Erdogan is keeping them inside Turkey. And if you criticize him too much, he's the kind of guy who's going to take his revenge on you. So, you always have these political expediencies that interfere essentially with this notion of having a universal or a general notion of standard.
Right here. In the middle, right here.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a independent researcher on CV issues. I'd be interested to know if anyone on the panel can put forward a country that has suffered from a terrorist attack and as a response has you think got a framework of law that hasn't overreacted but has responded to the new threat of terrorism in the 21st century, but has also included the civil liberties angles we've also talked about this morning.
Well, I don't think, I think we've had some very interesting papers, but I don't think anyone would identify the countries that we're talking about here as necessarily being the example to follow. I guess the question really is, if indeed the United States and the EU are the perceived leaders, are they in a position to either work better together or better to try to create a standard? But it's quite clear that I think in both examples, the perception would be that they would overreacted. And I think that was the point of the first panel. And I don't know if Melissa or even Jeff Kahn wants to add something to that in the back. You got a microphone to Jeff.
It's always dangerous to talk about a country you don't know very well. But as I was just thinking about this excellent question, one possibility might be, well, what about Norway, which suffered the worst attack by a lone wolf terrorist in its country's history, and I think comparable in the number of lives lost, the impact on society, the fear that it generated, and yet Norway did not declare a state of emergency. There wasn't a massive retrenchment in its legal system. And it seems in some ways, although the homogeneity of Norway makes it a case that would be very difficult to replicate perhaps, it perhaps might be the start to investigating the question that was just asked.
But wasn't he a Norwegian, the guy who did it? So it's not a foreign threat in the sense that it wasn't a Muslim extremist organization. So it's very different. I mean, if it was somebody who was called, you know, who was an Islamist terrorist, maybe Norway would have reacted differently.
The vast majority of terrorism attacks in the United States have been homegrown terrorists.
Okay. In the back here.
Quick question, you know, two for Melissa and one for the other panelists. European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, what roles have they played in response to what's happening in Poland and Hungary and France? And then obviously the European Court of Human Rights also applies to Russia and Turkey. What you've seen, anything happening in response to what's happening in those countries as well?
No, I don't have to. Yeah, there have been reviews. So some of the reviews that I'm talking about, this Article 7 procedure, that is something that, you know, could eventually be reviewed by the European Court of Justice. So I think that there is, you know, there is an engagement and there is thinking that there needs to be some sort of judicial review. In France, when France initiated its, I guess, second state of emergency or a second extension, they France also said that it's going to derogate from certain European Court, European Convention obligations, and the European Court can, in that instance, object and say, no, you can't, but they didn't object. And so I think that you'll see individual cases going to the European Court, probably from all three countries, but that those, because the procedures are, you know, even for an accelerated procedure goes very slowly, that you won't actually see responses for a while. Actually, in Hungary, there was a decision that came out recently, a couple of months ago, I guess, where the head of the Constitutional Court there had challenged his removal. And so the European Court said that that removal, of course, was, violated his rights to freedom of expression because he had criticized the constitutional reforms, and that's why he got removed. But the European Court can't put him back. And so there's, you know, even when the European Court acts, sometimes its power is very limited.
I don't know if in any case.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
No. Okay.
Hello. Well, my question would be about Turkey. Just before the coup, there was a big fight in Turkey. I mean, Turkey flattened about 10 towns like Nusaybin, Sur, Yüksekova, Silvan, and Cizre. So they used heavy weapons like artillery, helicopters, tanks, and everything against civilian population. So they used disproportionate force, and about 300,000 people were internally displaced. And according to government records, about 3,000 people, most of them civilians, were killed. So how would you describe Turkey's disproportionate force against its civilians within their country, their own citizens? And the second question is, again, about Turkey. Turkey has entered Syria into Jarablus, and now they have troops in Iraq, in Bashika. What's Turkey's ambition, and how sustainable is this Turkish policy? Thank you.
Look, let me start with the second question first. In some ways, it's easier. What the Turks are trying to do, and this has nothing to do with some of the topics we're talking about, but the aim of the Turkish intervention in both in Syria and in Iraq is essentially to prevent Syrian Kurds and Turkish Kurds from essentially establishing or institutionalizing themselves in both of these places, given the fact that there is a great deal of uncertainty in both places. I mean, in Syria, the Turks are very upset that the United States is aligning itself with the Syrian Kurds. they see, in fact, I mentioned earlier that to his credit, Erdogan had started the peace negotiations with the Turkish Kurds, and he abandoned it, and he abandoned it because of the Syrian Kurds, because the Syrian Kurds who are affiliated with the Turkish Kurds and the Turkish Kurdish organization, the PKK, were essentially doing very, very well in Syria and establishing a zone for themselves, and he saw that as a strategic threat to Turkey. So that was the reason. So that's what, I mean, this is essentially, yes, it's the extension of domestic politics into a foreign country. I mean, so he's taking, Erdogan is taking kind of an aggressive position in order to prevent the Kurds from establishing themselves there. Domestically, look, I actually was in Diyarbakir, and I wanted to go to Sur, and the fighting had stopped, but you couldn't go in there, even though there was no fighting. They wouldn't let you go in. This was in June, and what I think, again, this is a deliberate political strategy of, let me finish. The reason there's so much fighting in the cities is because also the PKK decided to challenge the Turkish military in the cities rather than in the countryside like they usually do. So the government's reaction has been to a scorched the earth policy of, as you said, displacing people and shutting down some of these towns. The idea is that eventually, maybe they will settle other people. Maybe they will settle some of the Syrian refugees who, with the Syrian conflict not ending, you can't keep them in camps. So you can't keep so there is an attempt at changing and I'm extrapolating here, but an attempt to change the demographics of the region. So it is a deliberate political policy. That's all I can say.
Right here. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's been a very informative panel. I want to say that it's very troubling to see the approaches that have been taken in certain countries in response to terrorism. And so what I want to ask is to all of you, how, if any, protections have been afforded in these respective countries to protect those who've been trying to promote a public discussion on these issues? And if it is possible, can the EU step in to protect these people who are trying to only do good and instead are being criminalized, like you said, in Russia for extremism rather than those who are really trying to promote Islamic terrorism?
Maria.
Russia is part of European Council, and so the Venice Commission of European Council, basing on the information gathered by Russian civil society organizations, issued recommendations to change the anti-extremist law, but the Russian authorities pay no attention to such recommendations. I should say that, of course, the EU do a lot of things to support Russian civil society organizations, and that is very important in the situation. But it is impossible right now to change things.
I think when it comes to Turkey, look, neither the US nor the European Union have really criticized the Turks for this, shall we say, onslaught on people that don't agree with, essentially, with the government. I mean, most of the journalists who are in jail are journalists who are who oppose the government policy, whether it's on the Kurdish issue, whether it is on a whole variety of issues, and not a peep. But even if there was, it would have no impact. I mean, in the case of the two brothers, I mentioned one, the economist who's in jail now because he's sending subliminal messages. I mean, this is a little bit ridiculous, you would agree, right? He and his brother are both in jail. His brother is a very distinguished author, a novelist, and former newspaper editor, and so on and so forth. Both of these have been remanded into custody, and there's been a campaign among authors in Europe and United States. Nobel laureates have signed petitions. Completely ignored. The Turkish press doesn't even talk about it because the Turkish press is not allowed to talk about it.
What can the EU or other entities do to protect individuals? I mean, I do think that there are more protections. For example, there are a number of large organizations in France that are speaking out on behalf of individuals that are focused on Islamophobia in particular, anti-migrant issues, anti-Semitism, some of the problems that you're seeing increasing in France. And so I think that because they have a robust civil society and they have a well-functioning judiciary that has actually criticized and held on to unconstitutional some provisions of their recent laws, you see some protections there. I think that and Poland also, great, really robust civil society. People have been protesting the Constitutional Tribunal. This is very geeky, a very geeky area, but you see thousands of people in many cities in Poland protesting on a very regular basis. So they're paying attention, and there are watchdog organizations there. I think Hungary has been a little bit more closed, and that's where, you have organizations like the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union that I think is doing a great job, but there probably needs to be more attention brought there.
Okay. Take the last question right here, Jerry.
Thank you. Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Thank you for a great discussion. The title of this panel is International Strategies for Balancing Civil Liberty and Security. So I have two questions, really. Number one, why do you think the international strategy would lead to a more, quote, liberal, quote, balance, as opposed to a more conservative, quote, balance? Why do you think that the international discussion or international civil society organization would necessarily wind up where I think Human Rights First wants it to be, number one? And number two, it seems to me the trajectory of the last decade has been to weaken international organizations, not to strengthen them, whether that's the United Nations or the EU or whatever. So even if there were a balance more toward the liberal or more towards security or less towards security and more towards civil liberty, I don't see that the strength of an international consensus or international organizations would necessarily result in a different policy, a different domestic policy, let alone the effectiveness of that, putting it into effect.
Well, since I'm the one who actually wrote that title, I think I'll take a crack as to what we were trying to do. And I think what we were really emphasizing, and I think what these two panels have shown, is that, in fact, each countries are taking different strategies themselves. I don't think the assumption was that necessarily the balance is necessarily moving in a liberal direction. Indeed, I think the reason why we chose to specifically emphasize Russia and Turkey was to highlight the fact that, in fact, this is not necessarily the trend, and that the kind of use of the trend towards to not pursuing that balance is, in fact, a part of for lack of a better word, a more authoritarian approach that actually has some appeal as well. And I think that was what we were trying to get at, that just because the EU and the United States have similar approaches, and we haven't even talked about privacy issues in the EU. I'm sure that could take multiple panels to kind of deal with, but we haven't addressed those issues, but at least that's kind of the area that we're talking about, that we're trying to address the issues that were raised in the first panel about access to information, about how you create access to rule of law institutions in balancing these types of issues. But I think what's important and what we wanted to show by including other countries is that no, that trend is, that is one trend, but it's not the only trend. And that the question really going forward is, does the US-EU idea of trying to balance these civil liberties continue potentially to fall behind a more authoritarian approach that doesn't concern with the balance of civil liberties, but simply uses the question of anti-terrorism to pursue domestic strategies? I think that's what was brought up with Henri and with Maria. So I think was the impetus behind the title. And I think today's panelists have highlighted the fact that there is not, in fact, one strategy, that there are multiple strategies, and that there is not necessarily a guarantee or a clear push that it's going to lead to a liberal response.
But let me ask you a question. I mean, if there hadn't been ISIS and these attacks in Europe and 9/11, no Al-Qaeda. So go back to the pre 9/11 atmosphere. Would today have been different in terms of, would the EU and the United States be different in their behavior?
In terms of?
Towards this issue of balancing civil liberties and in terms of what they say to other countries?
I think the EU and the US have very different attitudes towards privacy. And when you look at all the discussions that have taken place about finding safe havens and defining safe havens for privacy and information, the US and the EU have taken very different approaches to elements of privacy. And to those who are following the negotiations about TTIP and international trade and how that emerges, issues of privacy will be central to those discussions. And overcoming the disputes between the EU and the United States on issues of privacy will be difficult. So I think that even pre-9/11, these issues were, the US and the EU were taking different approaches. I think what the post-9/11 and the most recent events in Europe have shown is that the assumption that even within the EU, that they would kind of form a balanced, common response in terms of balancing these approaches has not taken place. And I think that's what Melissa so clearly brought up in her discussion, that in Poland and in Hungary, attempts to use the constitutional courts that were, especially in Hungary, which was seen as the initial protector of all these civil liberties, especially after the collapse of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, that has been a very dramatic turn in internal EU politics. And again, it makes this whole question about how one balances civil liberties and anti-terrorism even more complex, because even within the EU now you have these multiple strategies and multiple directions. And so how does one begin to kind of resolve those internal conflicts, as well as try to have a more international conversation on these issues? So that was kind of, again, the idea behind the conversation. But I think we've finished our panel, so I want to thank all our panelists for their excellent presentations. Thank you for your questions. And we're now going to go to our cafe and have lunch and a lunchtime speaker as well.
Very interesting to hear, yeah.